What's up, dudes? I'm just on a roll today, okay, guys? Like, I am just ready to get this thing read. I'm ready to get it read so that we can move on, because I am going to just read this little book about fuckface, because we're not going to have all these lies and deceptions going on, okay? And I know that I mentioned in another video, a friend, an old regular, just like, I stand with Fauci. Like, are you dumb? And this person, okay, I hope this person never sees this video. They were a specialization, okay? They're not just a regular doctor. And not like a dermatologist, okay? Like a very respected specialization, okay, that they had in their career. And to see this just craziness, I mean, standing with Fauci? Okay. All right, girl. Anyways, okay, so we left off reading about Huxley at work, and now we're going to pick up with a section heading titled The Roots of the Flower People. So I guess this is about the hippie movement and how, that was created and whatever. All right, so back in California, Gregory Bateson had maintained the Huxley operation out of the Palo Alto VA hospital. Bateson, one of the most colorful characters of the epic, was former husband of anthropologist Margaret Mead. Bateson himself, a renowned anthropologist with the OSS, quote, became the director of a hallucinogenic drug experimental clinic at the Palo Alto Veterans Administration Hospital. Under Bateson's auspices, the initiating cadre of the LSD cult, the hippies, were programmed. Quote, through the LSD experimentation on patients already hospitalized for psychological problems, Bateson established a core of, quote, initiates into the psychedelic ISIS cult. Here is a bit of what Michael Mendocino in the Campaigners April 1974 issue had to say. Quote, foremost among his Palo Alto recruits was Ken Kesey. In 1959, Bateson administered the first dose of LSD to Kesey. By 1962, Kesey had completed a novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which popularized the notion that society is a prison and the only truly free people are the insane, end quote. It is worth noting that during the 1960s, the Tavistock clinic, they still have a clinic, fostered the notion that no criteria for sanity exist and that psychedelic mind-expanding drugs are valuable tools of psychoanalysis. Kesey subsequently organized a circle of LSD initiates called the Merry Pranksters. This goofy band toured the United States spreading LSD and, quote, establishing the pretext for high volume of publicity on behalf of the still minuscule, quote, counterculture. Well, that's because they were acting like a bunch of idiots. And I think they were like following around the Grateful Dead or something. I don't know. Oh, my coffee is gone. My coffee is gone. Okay. Let me see if I can pause it. Hold on. Ha, awesome. Okay. So, Mendocino's report continued. By 1967, the Kesey cult had handed out such quantities of LSD that a sizable drug population, flower children, had emerged. Centered in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, here Huxley collaborator Bateson set up a free clinic staffed by Dr. David Smith, later a medical advisor for the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML, and Dr. Peter Bourne, formerly President Carter's special assistant on drug abuse, end quote. All right, the pagan connection. Yet, it was not until the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, that really created the climate of moral despair and rot that spurred America's youth to rely on drugs. In other words, the war was used as a backdrop against which to create the anti-war movement. Their disillusionment with the war made the protesters easy prey for their masters to condition them under the guidance of the Tavistock Institute and the CIA through the influence of the LSD drug culture. I'm not suggesting that most anti-war protesters were paid agents for the elite circles. On the contrary, as Crichton Zoakos suggests, quote, the overwhelming majority of anti-war protesters went into the students for a democratic society organization on the basis of outrage at the developments in Vietnam. But once caught in the environment defined by the Tavistock Institute psychological warfare experts and inundated with the message that hedonistic pleasure seeking was a legitimate alternative to immoral war, the protesters' sense of values and their creative potential went up in a cloud of hashish smoke. Quote, the outcome of this debacle was a major strategic withdrawal from Asia by the United States, spelled out in Henry Kissinger's Guam Doctrine, adoption of the spectacular failure known as the China Card strategy for containing Soviet influence and demoralization of the American people over the war to point that the sense of national pride and confidence in the future progress of the Republic was badly damaged, end quote. That moral despair is what the Frankfurt School had hoped for back when they were looking for new cultural forms to increase the alienation of the population. Divide and conquer, divide and conquer, divide and conquer. I said that, not the book. They found it in a newly created Rockefeller Tavistock sponsored and financed organization, IPS, Institute for Policy Studies. Very interesting. All right, now let me go fix my cup of coffee. I'll be right back. All right, man, dude, I love coffee. It's so good. I've made a total mess. So good. Okay, now where were we? We were going to start this new header. The Institute for Policy Studies. Established in 1963, IPS was run by President Kennedy's National Security Advisor and former president of Ford Foundation, McGeorge Bundy, one of the architects of U.S. policy toward Vietnam, particularly the notorious Strategic Hamlet programs and the murderous Operation Phoenix program in the Mekong Delta region. IPS's main assignment was to control and coordinate a wide array of pseudo-organizations, from local community control and black nationalist groups to anti-technology organizations, anti-war movement, and terrorist operations such as the Weathermen, especially under the auspices of the anti-war movement, to zero-growth environmentalist freak shows. Quote, operations of the sort, which were pioneered by British intelligence agencies, which place more major emphasis on the use of private institutions whose overall activity is inextricably linked to official government institutions, end quote. So, and I think that's all just to make these movements look more legit, more grassroots, more whatever. Okay. In short, the entirety of what became known in the 1960s as the, quote, New Left movement, and their well laid out deconstruction of Georgy Arbatov's book, The War of Ideas in Contemporary International Relations, the investigative team of EIR writes, quote, the FBI and sections of the CIA have provided the controllers and deployment managers of the, quote, New Left. IPS has provided the cover stories and the ideological management. So they're just making shit up. Chief theoretician for the IPS was none other than Noam Chomsky, one of the founders of the New Left. For Chomsky, the primary purpose for creating the New Left of the early 1960s was to preempt the radicalization of college youth strata to two overlapping ends. Immediately, the purpose was to prevent the established socialist parties from effectively capturing the social ferment which had erupted beginning in 1958, which had come to focus around the Cuban Revolution and Civil Rights Movement up through mid-1961. At the same time, such enterprises as the Peace Corps, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and Foundation-sponsored community action projects for radicals in development at that time to drain off student radicalism into staffing of an expanding counterinsurgency apparatus around the Reesian fascist concept of local community control. In an exclusive report on the Institute for Policy Studies, the investigative team from Executive Intelligence Review points out that, quote, it is important to note that these operations are the outcome of political intelligence operations set up prior to World War I under the auspices of National Civic Federation and the Russell Sage Foundation, and which were officially institutionalized following World War II under the aegis of the CIA, end quote. So, meddling Zionists are all over the place. Literally all over the place, bro. And an exclusive report on the Institute. Okay, wait, I already read that. The Institute for Policy Studies lists among its lecturers and fellows members of the Weatherman Group, a U.S. radical left organization consisting of splintered off members and leaders of the Students for a Democratic Society. In anti-war activities, IPS members carried out a series of militant actions, including bombings and violent protests, to achieve the overthrow of the U.S. government. This group was also part of the counterculture controlled from within by the U.S. So they'll do this stuff themselves and then make laws because, we've got these insurgent groups that are like anti-government. It's like, no, y'all are the ones, the government is the ones doing this psyops to create these wars to further strip away our freedom. It's been happening for the longest, okay? These school shootings, all this freaking BS. It's all BS. All of it's BS. It's all BS. Can you see that now? All right. Okay. Funding of IPS and related institutions. Oh, wait, hold on. Did I? No, I didn't. Hold on. We got to finish this. Spending off members and leaders of Democrats and anti-war activities, the overthrow of this. Okay. The Cambridge Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, Holland, and related organizations, quote, such as the group of so-called ex-CIA and military intelligence personnel around counter-spy, promote such policies to seed the political climate with the idea that many of these actually covert operations are really expressions of popular political will. With the help of the mass media and selected newspapers, many of the operations were made to appear as legitimate expressions of a political point of view. So that's what I just said. The government is doing all these psyops. They're making them look like they are grassroots activist movements from the people, and they're not. All of them are bought and paid for through non-governmental organizations, and the money is just funneled. I mean, like, wow. Okay, the funding of IPS and related institutions. The foundations that provide the money to maintain the illegal activities of the Institute can be divided into two basic categories. First, top-level foundations, all linked to the Rockefeller family, such as the Rockefeller Family Fund, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Ford Foundation, serve as organizations that disperse funds for the specific operations. What these specific operations are, we really do not know, as the official reports never identify their purpose. Instead, a cover organization or activity is used to facilitate the disbursement of funds. On the second level, foundations such as the Kaplan Fund and Stern Fund serve as conduits for political and covert functions. And I just want you to notice what type of names these are. Kaplan and Stern. They sound Ashkenazi J to me. Shminist, if you must. And we know the other, like the Rockefellers. I mean, we already know. They've definitely funded Shmianism. So, like, do you see now? How, like, even going back into this, the philosophy of these people and their anti-Christ, anti-Christian, anti-God rhetoric and point of view. Are we starting to see now, like, who these people are that are still doing this to us? I hope. Okay. The case of Marcus Raskin. The key individual involved with IPS was Marcus Raskin, intimately linked to the top levels of Rockefeller's political intelligence machine. Raskin's earlier training came to the University of Chicago Law School, a political factory for Rockefeller agents and operatives. By the mid-1960s, Rockefeller and the founders of the Institute for Policy Studies, Hans Morgenthau, a Rockefeller man and one of the founding fathers of the, quote, realist school of the 20th century, and McGeorge Bundy began to establish a cover for running anarchist leftist operations via the co-opting and influencing of vast international network of operatives for black operations. This was done through the National Security Council's secret unit known as Special Staff that planned to coordinate and the psycho-political operations used to manipulate the American public, and through a vast intergovernmental undercover infrastructure that include the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, such as the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, and the Director of the CIA. Those who control television, radio, and newspaper corporations, who head the largest law firms, who run the largest and most prestigious universities and think tanks, who direct the largest private foundations, and who direct the largest public corporations. Within the special staff, Raskin became one of the overseers of special covert operations and destabilization scenario planning, a unique experience in creating and developing terror. So, all of this, Islamic terror bull crap it's just more BS. It's really the J's. A vital part of the operation was the creation of the umbrella of the student anti-war movement, Students for a Democratic Society in the U.S., with the help of the leading U.S. figures in the social democratic, quote, Second International, end quote, such as Michael Harrington and UAW leaders Victor and Walter Reuther. The SDS, created by the League for Industrial Democracy, became the flagship, quote, synthetic New Left, end quote, organization for spinning off phony leftist operations internationally, otherwise known as doing psyops. In turn, the League of Industrial Democracy was financed and run by the Institute for Policy Studies. And you see how one institute is funding another, is funding another, is funding another. So this money is becomes so hard to track and trace to even know who is trying to destabilize your civilization. All right. Through a process of splitting and then regrouping such organizations, a selection procedure was established for creating terrorist organizations. Raskin supervised this operation starting in 1963 and including the period when the Weathermen and other terrorist organizations were set up, end quote. As a co-director of IPS, Raskin initiated a series of projects designed for the profiling and eventual deployment of the various regroupments of SDS and left groups internationally. Quote, he supervised the Radical Education Project, created in part by the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, the U.S.'s leading conflict resolution think tank. Raskin had also been thoroughly trained in psychological profiling through the National Training Laboratories, a project set up for the Rockefellers by the German fascist psychologist Kurt Lewin. NTL specializes in brainwashing through various methods, quote, including transactional analysis and therapy and group therapy, as well as harder brainwashing methods, all employed to create the social basis for running terrorist operations, end quote. For example, the, quote, second generation of the Bader-Meinhof gang from the graduates of the Heidelberg Patients Collective, an experimental program using mental patients in which the patients were indoctrinated according to R.D. Ling, Tavistock schizophrenia reinforcing program. Reinforcing schizophrenia, you say? And also as a part of the program assigned to develop the capability to produce bombs, end quote. What? These people were nuts, bro. Like, absolutely nuts. Quote, not only was there irrationalist anarchist indoctrination, largely under the guidance of IPS, but, quote, sensitivity sessions, end quote, degraded sexual practices, and emphasis on the use of LSD and other drugs were dominant features of the conditioning process. The rock drug counterculture, including sexually and otherwise degraded communal living conditions, is the general rule among the strata for which terrorists are recruited, end quote. This is the true base of the, quote, radical youth idealism, end quote, of the 1960s, known as the counterculture movement that spawned the Weathermen and every extreme left-wing organization in the United States. Under the auspices of Tavistock Institute and the assorted support structure, such as IPS, the indoctrination terrorist program functioned in the following manner. The intake process began with a leftist environmentalist profiling and recruitment under the auspices of Amnesty International. It would last several weeks with drugs and wife swapping, apart from, quote, leaderless group approaches to deeper political indoctrination. The second principal stage involved a months-long period augmented with drug use and sexual degradation. The third stage was Longo Mai itself, where would-be terrorists and, quote, revolutionaries, end quote, would receive basic training in weapons with instructions given by ex-legionnaires and professional terrorists. Thus, quote, the environmentalist, end quote, communalism of Longo Mai, made famous by the, quote, generation of 68, end quote, was only a cover for terrorist basic training, conditioning, and preparation. Quote, the next stage is intake into a terrorist group, with further training at another camp anywhere in the Mediterranean region, including Yasharel. See? You keep looking, and that pile of shit's going to be sitting there. It should be noted that this intake process for screening of potential terrorist recruits is identical with the development of the hardcore of the environmentalist movement. The terrorists are distilled from the environmentalist, Maoist movements, or recruited from among prison inmates, largely through either in-prison therapy programs or through, quote, halfway house programs. A convict with a pre-established propensity for crimes of violence and a potential psychosis is the most easily deployed, expendable sort of recruit to terrorist and related operations. Wow. Quote, neither the terrorist nor the typical terrorist support group in any way corresponds to the myth of idealists misled into excess in one way or another. But apart from the fully conscious controllers among them, are criminalized psychotics or semi-psychotics, either selected because of those pre-existing qualities or because various phases of conditioning bring about these states, end quote. What? That's crazy. Having gone to prison myself, that's wild to me that they would just pick people and like indoctrinate them so that when they get out, they'll like go and do crimes for the cause. That's crazy to me, man. According to Tavistock profiling of the terrorist, quote, the individual is able to perform functions involving his immediate person and environment. He can function. Where his psychosis shows most clearly is in his ability to cope sanely with abstractions concerning the world in general. In other words, he lives at best within a very small world, a world defined by a very short span of social distance surrounding his or her person, end quote. Tavistock controllers then delve deeper, giving a remarkable insight into the control mechanisms of the subject. He functions within a scope of a surrogate family, more or less, as a disturbed but functionally effective 2 to 4-year-old might. To be more exact, an adolescent or adult parody of such a 2 to 4-year-old condition. The world outside his or her family is not real. His or her outer world behavior is biased toward the schizophrenic symbolic rather than the real. His sense of that world of symbols is magic, not the cause and effect. He or she carries the infantile superstition of the believer in astrology toward an extreme. Now, if such a person once agreed that, quote, bad people ought to die, quote, so they can't hurt good people, end quote, and if a, quote, person who is dedicated to killing the, quote, bad people himself It suffices to make the point short to insert a face, a name, and so forth in place of the symbol bad and say, we must kill that bad person, and there you have the gist of it, end quote. Hold on one second. I gotta let the dog out. Apologies. All right. She's going to be scratching on the door in 2 more seconds. And I've lost my place. Okay. That's where the controlled media comes into play. The key to aiding the zombie terrorist deployment into action are certain, quote, code phrases. For example, the code phrase used in organizing the Baader-Meinhof assassination of Dresden Bank's Jürgen Ponto in 1977 was the epithet Nazi communist, end quote. How would such a label be used by the controllers to motivate a would-be terrorist to kill his intended target? Quote, if one knows the doctrine of Winston Churchill, Hugh Trevor Roper, and John Wheeler Bennett, the doctrine they set forth in defending their preference for Adolf Hitler to the insurgent German generals of 1938 and during the war, one knows that the British not only have a special hatred for German industrialists and the old Catholic Center Party of Germany, but that the British who created Hitler saw fit to accomplish 2 objectives with one argument. The argument that Nazism was a product of German industry. See, these MFs came up with both of them, communism and Nazism, okay? Quote, although the myth that German industrialism created Hitler is in wide circulation, the myth has strong primary emotional significance only in 2 primary circles, British intelligence circles and a certain section of Schmionist circles. In Schmionist circles, it serves as a reaction formation in respect to Warburg backing of Hjalmar Schacht and of Schacht's placing Hitler in the Chancellery and of various Rothschild, Oppenheimer, and other involvement in supporting Hitler before and after 1933 into 1936 and 1938 period. What'd I say? Schminists. They're literally freaking everywhere. I mean, is it starting to like sink in? Like, who has been up behind all of this ish the whole entire time? Okay. Quote. Hold on. Okay, my bad. All right. Let's see. Where were we now? Okay. Yeah, we were talking about the Schminists. Okay, quote. This emotionally laden identification of German industrialism as being axiomatically Nazism spills over from British intelligence and certain Schminist circles into elements of the anarchist, environmentalist, ultra-left, especially those layers surrounding and including left terrorist gangs. In these circles, Nazi means essentially German industrialism and is extendable to any pro-industrial, pro-technological progress, personality, or influence or political current which is viewed as practically the same thing as German industrialist, end quote. To leave no confusion concerning the significance of Schmionism in this case is an interpolated clarification respecting the command structure coordinating international terrorist operations should be made now. The key elements controlling international terrorism include the, quote, fascist international coordinated by the Eastern European branch of the Maltese Order, the Sovereign Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. They also include British Roundtable, an official intelligence organization. They also include elements of the Socialist International and elements of international Schmionism. So, I think we can see now that God's chosen here. This is just the biggest lie ever. And that a lot of these people that claim to be God's chosen are seeking to destroy Western culture. And it's obviously maybe not just Schmionists, but Schmionism is definitely used as a weapon. The church is brainwashed by it. Like it's out of control. Christianity is totally brainwashed by this ridiculous idea of Judeo-Christian anything. That's a contradiction in terms. That's like saying left, right. or of down. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's BS. Okay. So now we have the header called Creating the Counterculture. The undeclared cultural war against America's youth began in earnest in 1967, when Tavistock began using open-air rock concerts to attract over 4 million young people to the so-called festivals. Unbeknownst, the youth became the victims of planned wide-scale drug experimentation. Hallucinogenic drugs such as dimethoxyphenyl lethalamine, or STP, phencyclidine, PCP, and dextromethorphan, which is like a cough syrup, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or MDA, dimethyltryptamine, which is DMT, and the Beatles promoted LSD, and blue microdot LSD 25 were freely distributed at these concerts. Before long, over 50 million of these attendees between the ages of 10 to 25 years old returned home to become the messengers and promoters of the new drug culture, or what became to be called the, quote, New Age. And there is so much New Age thought and belief still in the festival scene, but it's just like the ravers and stuff now that have adopted this hippie, hoodoo, voodoo, whatever. And I do like EDM music, and I have bartended plenty of festivals, and it's still pretty pervasive. I know there's a Christian guy on YouTube. I cannot think of his name, but he was essentially like a festival promoter and hung out with these people a lot. And God finally got him and was like, hey, don't be doing this no more. And so he repented and gave his life to Jesus, which is always good. Okay. Hallucinogenic drugs are psychomimetic, meaning that they mimic certain aspects of psychosis. Through the use of hallucinogenic drugs, one can induce temporary symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. Most users of hallucinogenic drugs at the time experienced whole personality changes, causing total alterations of the senses. The intention of the LSD drug scene and the controlled environment it represented wasn't accidental, but completely intentional. The Tavistock Institute had extensively studied the relationship between brain and behavior caused by hallucinogenic drugs. Quote, later on, the knowledge gleaned from the research was channeled into marketing MTV and radio stations through classic oldies songs from 15 to 20 years ago, which are targeted at the adult population, end quote. Several Tavistock studies showed that a song or piece of music associated with one's childhood, when heard later in life, could call forth memories and associations of that earlier period. Encoded memories of popular music in the listener were recalled when he or she heard the same piece of music. These memories triggered an emotional drug flashback that set off an infantile emotional state that brought the listener back to that time in which he or she experienced either an identical or one mirroring the drug reaction itself. And then they go to talk about the Monterey Pop Festival. The first commercial American rock festival, officially dubbed, quote, the first annual Monterey International Pop Festival, end quote, was held in June 1967, 2 years before Woodstock, when over 200,000 young people gathered in and around the Monterey County Fairgrounds in Northern California for a 3-day celebration. I remember Jimi Hendrix played this. I mean, I was there then, obviously, but my dad was a huge Jimi Hendrix fan, and so was I. And I remember he did, I think he did the national anthem. I think that's when he did the national anthem and set his guitar on fire. I don't remember. But anyways, Monterey Pop 1967 was the general rehearsal for the widespread distribution of a new type of drugs, classified as psychedelics or hallucinogens, such as LSD, which were to become prominent and widespread at later outdoor festivals like Woodstock. Author Robert Santelli, in his book Aquarius Rising, writes, quote, LSD was in abundance at Monterey. Tabs of Monterey Purple, LSD-type substance, also call it purple haze, were literally given to anyone wishing to experiment a little, end quote. The two characters responsible for its distribution at Monterey Pop were a mystery man from Cocoa Beach, Florida, called Peter Goodrich, and the legendary CIA contract agent codenamed, quote, Coyote. One of the organizers of the Monterey Pop Festival was John Phillips, a member of the Mamas and the Papas rock group and former press agent for the Beatles. Phillips was closely linked with Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon Tate, Mama Cass, lead singer of the Mamas and the Papas, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, and many other Hollywood celebrities who in turn were linked with Charles Manson's family. Manson family members stabbed to death an 8-month pregnant actress Sharon Tate on August 9, 1969, in her home in Los Angeles. Mama Cass and John Phillips were connected to Manson through, quote, the Process Church of the Final Judgment, end quote, an offshoot of the Church of Scientology founded in England in the mid-60s by a couple of former Scientologists, Robert and Marianne de Grimston. Formed sometime in 1963 and 64, PCFJ was a mixture of reincarnation, existentialism, an attempt to merge the worships of Jehovah and Lucifer, and a bit of neo-Nazi flavor. It is significant that, quote, the processes and, quote, legal work was handled by an elite Wall Street law firm, Morris and McVeigh, whose main backer was American Family Foundation, who used intelligence-connected, quote, mind control experts such as LSD researcher Dr. Louis Jolyon West to orchestrate, quote, cult anti-cult hysteria. Dr. West was a major participant in the CIA's MK Ultra, which came out of the Tavistock Institute studies of Nazi social control techniques, end quote. People with only a passing knowledge of the Manson case usually don't realize that, quote, the Beach Boys recorded one of Manson's songs and released it as the B-side of their cover of the old Ersel Hickey 1958 hit Bluebirds Over the Mountain, end quote, a song about lost love, end quote. The title of the song was suggestive of the CIA mind control operation. Bluebird was a program for exploring the uses of hypnosis and other means to protect the recently created CIA and its personnel from empty psychic penetration. Bluebird. Is there a reason Manson's song was on the flip side of the, quote, Bluebird cover? Had the CIA's, quote, Bluebird escaped? Was Manson a, quote, Bluebird, i.e. mind control subject, gone amok? I don't know. I think he was doing exactly probably what he was told to do. As Peter Lavonda explains in Sinister Forces, quote, the land of memory was the target of the Bluebird Project. To enter that, quote, land in another person's mind. To go through the drawers, rearranging the furniture, and leave unnoticed. Korean War was fought to a stalemate. End quote. Vietnam was raging all around us. Africa was ablaze with godless communists holding the upper hand. In America, the year 1968 was the pivotal year in the lives of most people of the generation. It was a time of multiple assassinations, civil unrest, the riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the election of Richard Nixon as president. For many, it signaled the death of a dream. For some, the rebirth of a nightmare. It was the year when those things that are now so secret, so classified, and behind the scenes were up front and in your face. The Cold War, the CIA, Prague Spring. It was the year that Frankfurt School, Tavistock Institute, Institute for Policy Studies, and other like-minded organizations went to war against America. It was the year of Woodstock and the age of Aquarius and the death of all that we held dear. It wasn't only, quote, flowers in the hair, end quote, that they got. They also got scrambled brains and total dependency on narcotics, a shortened lifespan, a degraded lifestyle, which tended to sink lower and lower into the mire. And I don't find no lies detected there. The Age of Aquarius, Woodstock Music Festival. The largest concert of all time, the open-air, quote, Woodstock Music and Art Fair, end quote, was what Time magazine labeled an Aquarian festival and, quote, history's largest happening, end quote. In the process, Woodstock became part of the cultural lexicon. Publicists carefully used the term Aquarian. According to astronomers, the ages progress in retrograde motion, going in the opposite direction as the sun, which moves from the age of Aquarius into the age of Pisces, into the age of Aries, and so forth, if you follow astrological beliefs, which I do not. The age of, the age of Pisces, an artifact of the precession of the equinoxes, is the time span from about 200 BC until the current day, approximately every 2160 years. The precession of the equinoxes appears to rotate the spring equinox from one constellation to another. We appear to be ending the age of Pisces and beginning the age of Aquarius. Moving into the Aquarian age signifies that the age of Pisces, which is the age of Christ, has come to an end. End quote. Quote, at Woodstock, writes journalist Donald Faw, quote, nearly 500,000 youth gathered to be drugged and brainwashed on a farm. The victims were isolated, immersed in filth, pumped with psychedelic drugs, and kept awake continuously for 3 straight days, and all with full complicity of the FBI and government officials. Okay, where was I? Okay, once again, it was the networks of British military intelligence and the CIA who were the initiators, of course. A man credited with Woodstock's creation was Artie Kornfeld, the director of Capitol Records, which is owned by EMI. EMI, led by aristocrat Sir Joseph Lockwood, stands for Electrical Music Industries, and unknown to most, is one of Britain's largest producers of military electronics and a key member of Britain's military intelligence establishment as a military contractor to the British War Office. Furthermore, EMI's silent partner is another major record label, RCA, which is also active in military and space electronics and satellite communications. Isn't that odd? It is a classic example of what President Dwight Eisenhower would have called, quote, the military-industrial complex. Yeah, but is really the one-world government solidifying everything into fewer and fewer hands, end quote. The money for Woodstock was supplied by John Roberts, the heir of the large Pennsylvania-based Block Drugs pharmaceutical empire and toothpaste manufacturing fortune. That's very interesting, that pharmaceuticals and toothpaste, because we all know that fluoride in the toothpaste calcifies the glands there. Okay. Joel Rosenman, one of the 3 partners, writes, quote, as the concert neared, food and water were clearly going to be in short supply. Sanitary facilities overtaxed, tempters short, drugs overabundant. Worst of all, there was no way for anyone who wanted to leave, end quote. According to John Roberts, sitting in your own excrement was part of the original plan. We're going to hand out bananas at the gate to bind our patrons, end quote. Security for the concert was provided by a hippie commune called the Hog Farm, trained in the mass distribution of LSD. The Hog Farm's connection to drug distribution, however, was well known to concert organizers. John Roberts, Woodstock founder and director, writes, their fee was simply transportation to and from the festival, a peacekeeping force that looked, talked, and smelled like the crowd would be both highly credible and highly effective. And most important, they were wise in the ways of drugs, knowing good acid from bad, good trips from bummers, good medicine from poison, etc. But the famed undercover hippie commune, Hog Farm, was none other than West Coast psychedelic group called, quote, the Merry Pranksters, whose leader was none other than Ken Kesey, the same Kesey who wove his experiences as a volunteer in medical experiments into his book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The experiment begins. Donald Foe, in his book, The Satanic Roots of Rock, describes the event, quote, 2 days before the scheduled start of the concert, 50,000 kids had already arrived in Woodstock. Drugs immediately began to circulate, end quote. Foe, in this same book, continues, quote, for the next 3 days, the nearly 500,000 young people that arrived were subjected to continual drugs and rock music. Because of torrential rains, they were forced to wallow in knee-deep mud. There were no shelters and no ways to get out. Cars were parked over 8 miles away. Rosenman writes that the key to the Woodstock experiment was, quote, keeping our performers performing around the clock to keep the kids transfixed, end quote. On August 17th, the New York Times reported, quote, tonight, a festival announcer warned from the stage that badly manufactured acid, a term for LSD, was being circulated. He said, quote, you aren't taking poison acid. The acid's not poison. It's just badly manufactured acid. You're not going to die, so if you think you've taken poison, you haven't. But if you're worried, just take a half a tablet, end quote. The advice to nearly 500,000 people, just take a half a tablet, end quote, was given by none other than MK Ultra agent Wavy Gravy. I had no idea he was an MK Ultra. That's very interesting. He got his own Ben and Jerry's ice cream, didn't he? All right, we're going to come down and finish this, and then I'll stop this reading. It would be another decade before the counterculture became part of the American lexicon, but the first seeds of what was a giant secret project to turn the values of America inside out were sown. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, massive nationwide demonstrations, hippies, communes, dropout drug heads, the Nixon presidency, the Vietnam War were tearing the fiber of American society apart. The old world and the new collided head on, unbeknownst to the quote flower children that it was all part of a secret social and occult agenda designed by some of the most brilliant and diabolical minds in the world. Hidden away in prestigious foundations, corporations, and think tanks, these political and financial puppeteers ruthlessly and cunningly used pop culture to foster alienation and dysfunction, to achieve arrested development and family breakdown for personal gain. Through 1965 and 1969, the psychedelic movement gained much momentum and culminated with events like Woodstock. However, quick as it came, it was gone. LSD was outlawed, Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died, Timothy Leary dropped off his soapbox, and the United States, after failing miserably in Vietnam, drifted into a depressing 1970s. Yet once again, Tavistock was waiting, ready to exploit that apathy for their personal gain. Wild, man. This is probably the most interesting book that I've read thus far. And if you're still here, I just want to thank you so much. And if you want a perfume review or something, let me know. Like, I keep meaning to do them, but like, it's going to take a little bit more preparation on my part to actually do that. And unless I can get an upgrade on my phone, which I am planning on doing, I just have to go do it. But I may do that tomorrow while I'm out and about because I have a doctor's appointment. So anyways, I love you guys. I hope that everyone is learning something. And I hope that we're waking up to like the game that's being played on us in our minds and our hearts and our souls. And that we really wake up and realize that there truly is no other name under heaven by which man can be saved but Jesus. And I hope that you find him and that he finds you, and that, you know, that we can continue living in his will, because the times are definitely evil. Anyways, I love you guys. Peace out.